Okay, so right, well, thank you everyone for joining us. I'm really, really pleased to be able to welcome Laura Arnold. I think it's our first speaker from the UK since the pandemic began. So she's up at 7 o'clock her time, or well, probably up earlier. So Laura finished her PhD at the University of Edinburgh in 2018. I'm not sure if it was awarded in 2018 or 2019.
Off the top of my head, 2018, I think.
Oh, 18, never mind.
Time has become very strange in the last few years. So.
Yeah, that's not a problem. Anyway, the thesis was entitled A Grammar of Ambel, an Austronesian language of, I'm going to say, Raja Ampat in West New Guinea. She is currently a British Academy postdoctoral fellow at the University of Edinburgh. She's done an awful lot of field work in West Papua, and she has, even though she's a very recent PhD, she's published in various outlets, including Language Typology and Universals, Journal of the International Phonetic Association, Oxford Guide to Western Austronesian Languages, Language Documentation and Description, and Transactions of the Philological Society, and Oceanic Linguistics. She's won several prizes, including Best Dissertation and Postgrad Publication prizes at the University of Edinburgh, also the 10th R.H. Robbins Prize of the Philological Society, and she was recently shortlisted for the JIPA Most Illustrative Illustration Award, which is how I know her. I edited the illustration of Ambel, so it was very impressive work. We really enjoyed learning about the language, but she's not talking about Ambel today, I believe. Is that right?
I will be talking about Ambel a little bit, yes.
Oh, yeah, a little bit. Oh, that's great. All right then. So yeah, in that case, I'll hand it over to Laura and thank her once again for getting up early to talk to us.
All right, yeah, thank you very much, Maria, for that introduction. And also, first of all, I'd like to say a huge thank you to both Maria and Stephen for the invitation today. It is my real pleasure to be joining you from halfway around the world. As Maria said, it is 7 in the morning here, so I've made myself an extra large pot of Earl Grey, so I hope you'll forgive me if I sup while I talk. All right, so I will share my screen. Okay, so you should be able to see my slides now. Does everybody see okay? Yeah, getting some nods, cool. All right, so yes, today I'm going to be talking about some diachronic aspects of the word prosodic systems of the languages of Raja Ampat. So the Raja Ampat archipelago in eastern Indonesia is internationally famous as being the most marine biodiverse region on the planet. So if you're a deep sea diver, if you're interested in deep sea diving, you've probably already heard of the archipelago in that context. But Raja Ampat is also somewhat famous in the world of linguistics for having some very cross-linguistically unusual word prosodic systems. I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of these today, in particular focusing on tone splits conditioned by vowel height. Now, tone splits conditioned by vowel height are vanishingly rare worldwide, but they've occurred twice independently in Raja Ampat. So I'll show that these tone splits, they pose a theoretically interesting little puzzle, and I hope you'll agree with me that this puzzle deserves to put Raja Ampat on the phonetics and phonology map. Okay, so speaking of maps, some of you are probably wondering whereabouts in the world we're talking about. So the Raja Ampat archipelago lies just off the western tip of northwest New Guinea, off what we call the Bird's Head Peninsula here. So yeah, Raja Ampat just off the west coast of the Bird's Head. If we zoom into the Raja Ampat archipelago, it's comprised of 4 larger islands and then many hundreds of smaller islands as well. The larger islands from north to south are Waigeo in the north here, Batanta in the center, and Salawati just to the south. Salawati separated from the New Guinea mainland by this very narrow channel here. And then down in the south here we have Misol Island. Now, the Bird's Head region of New Guinea is incredibly linguistically diverse, but the majority of the languages spoken in the Raja Ampat archipelago today belong to the Austronesian language family. So if I color this map in, all of the green languages here, these are Austronesian languages. So relatively recent incomers to the area, probably about 3,000, 3,500 years ago, something like that. Within Austronesian, all of the languages spoken in Raja Ampat belong to the South Halmahera West New Guinea sub-branch. So South Halmahera West New Guinea, or Shweng for short, is the putative sister of Oceanic, the much larger and much better known Oceanic branch. Yeah, all of the languages are Shweng languages, and then within Shweng, most of the languages spoken in Raja Ampat belong to the sub-branch called Raja Ampat South Halmahera, or RASH for short. So if I highlight these languages here, all the languages that are highlighted, these are RASH languages. The non-highlighted languages is actually only one language, is the language Biak. This is spoken in various locations throughout the archipelago. Biak is a Shweng language, but it's a relatively recent incomer to the archipelago from further east in the New Guinea area. So yeah, it's the RASH languages of Raja Ampat I'm going to be talking about today. Okay, so for a bit of context, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Austronesian family tree, here it is. So this is the general overall structure. Shweng down at the bottom here, as I say, the sister of Oceanic. And if we zoom into Shweng, this is the current sub-classification of the Shweng sub-branch. So thanks to some excellent work by Dave Kamholtz, we now have a fairly good idea of how the various Shweng languages are related to each other. This is the Raja Ampat South Halmahera, the RASH branch here. As you can see, I've put the Raja Ampat languages, they're not in a tree branching structure here. This is because while Kamholtz, in his subclassification of the Shweng branch, he did subclassify the Raja Ampat languages. He subsequently retracted a lot of the work that he's done on the Raja Ampat languages with regards to classification in publications, subsequent publications. So at present, we don't actually know what the relationship, the relative relationship of the different Raja Ampat languages is to each other, and nor do we really know what the relationship of the Raja Ampat languages is to their sisters spoken in South Halmahera to the west of the Raja Ampat archipelago. Okay, so here's a roadmap for the rest of today's talk. So yeah, as I say, I'm going to be talking about tone splits that have occurred from vowel height in Raja Ampat. I'm going to be presenting two examples of these splits. The first one occurred in the Metnyo dialect of Ambel. I'll be presenting the data and walking you through the split in Ambel first. And then the second split occurred in a language called Maya. And again, I'll present the data, walk you through what happens. Now, as I said at the top of the talk, tone splits from vowel height are incredibly rare worldwide, so we've got a lot to talk about in the discussion. So I'm going to spend some time, for example, talking about the phonetic mechanisms that may have been involved in the splits, I'll bring in some cross-linguistic data. We'll take a look at various splits in other locations worldwide as well. Before wrapping up in a conclusion, and if I have time, then I'll talk a little bit about how the research that I'm talking about today feeds into my current postdoc project at Edinburgh. Okay, so first of all, the split in Ambel. So Ambel is spoken on Waigeo Island in the north of the archipelago here. Ambel, as Maria said in the introduction, is the language that I carried out my PhD research on. There are two dialects of Ambel, Metnyo Ambel, spoken in the south of the Ambel region down here, one village here and then one village here. And then Metnyo Ambel is spoken in the remaining Ambel villages in the north of the Ambel area here. So I'll give you a very brief introduction to Ambel phonology, just to set things in context. Segmentally, there's really not much to talk about. Very straightforward. Consonant inventory, 14 consonants, vocalic inventory, 5 vowels, nothing particularly exciting going on here. The only thing worth noting is that what was originally a labiodental fricative f has debuccalized to become the glottal fricative h in Metnyo Ambel. Syllable structure is pretty simple. Generally speaking, it's CV or CVC. There are more complex syllable structures, but that's the typical pattern. And words are generally either monosyllabic or disyllabic. Longer words are attested, but most of the lexicon is monosyllabic or disyllabic. Okay, so while the segmental inventory isn't that interesting, there is a system of lexical tone in both Metnyo and Metnyo Ambel. This is cool because tone is very unusual in Austronesian languages, but as we'll see in this talk, tone is actually attested in all of the Rash languages that we have data for. Okay, so the Metnyo tone system is very straightforward. It's a privative system in which high-toned syllables contrast with toneless syllables. So you get minimal pairs like ton, moon versus ton, thorn. Metnyo Ambel is slightly more complicated, so we have a three-way contrast between high specified syllables, rise specified syllables, and toneless syllables. Okay, so during my PhD project, I was interested, well, the PhD itself was a documentation and a description of Ambel. I come from sort of a historical and comparative background, so I was interested in looking at the tone systems of the two dialects and figuring out how the tone systems developed. So towards the end of my PhD project, I gathered some cognates from Metnyo and Metnyo and tried to figure out what the tonal correspondences were in order to work my way back to what the tone system of Proto-Ambel might have been. And I focused, at that stage, I only looked at monosyllabic cognates. And the reason for this was, while I had a very good grasp of what was going on in the word prosody of Metnyo Ambel, and that was the dialect that I looked at for my PhD. I was only able to collect a very little bit of data from Metnyo Ambel right at the very end of my PhD fieldwork, so just in the last few weeks. So I was less confident at the time I was looking at the cognates with regards to the word prosodic system of Metnyo Ambel in the polysyllables specifically. I've got a better idea now of what's going on with Metnyo Ambel, so I definitely need to revisit the data and take another look, but I'll just be presenting what I looked at with regards to the monosyllabic cognates here. Okay, so I identified 62 monosyllabic cognates between Metnyo and Metnyo, which could be divided into 5 different correspondence sets, depending on the tonal correspondences between the monosyllabic cognates. So in correspondence set A, monosyllables which had a high specification in Metnyo corresponded to monosyllables with a high specification in Metnyo. There were 22 cognates, 22 of those 62 cognates are in correspondence set A, and these are very straightforwardly reconstructible with high tone in Proto-Ambel. So Proto-Ambel was tonal. Correspondence sets D and E, I'm not going to talk too much about these today because I only had 5 cognates in sets D and E. In these sets, what unites both these sets is that the cognates in Metnyo have rise tone, and in Metnyo either are toneless or have high tone. I reconstruct these with rise tone in Proto-Ambel. I won't go into the details here, but yeah, 5 cognates, it's not enough to make any reconstructions with any confidence. But what I am going to be focusing on is the correspondence sets B and C, so the correspondence sets in which the Metnyo cognates are toneless, and the Metnyo cognates are either toneless or have a high specification. And what I'm going to argue is that these forms can be reconstructed to Proto-Ambel as toneless, and that there was a split in Metnyo Ambel such that the monosyllables which had close vowel nuclei, so nuclei that are reconstructed with E or U, they remained toneless, whereas monosyllables with non-close vowel nuclei, E, A, or O, they developed high tone and they merged with the high tone of Proto-Ambel. Okay, so let's take a look at the correspondence set B first of all. So this is the correspondence set in which the Metnyo monosyllables are toneless and the Metnyo syllables are toneless as well. Okay, so there are 24 items in correspondence set B. And of these 24, 15 can very straightforwardly be reconstructed with a close vowel, E or U. Okay, so these 15 are represented by the first 6 items here. So as you can see, in the Metnyo form, there's a close vowel. In the Metsam form, there's a close vowel. In the Metnyo form, there's a close vowel. If we look at other Rash cognates, other cognates from elsewhere in the Rash branch, we find overwhelmingly close vowels. So it's very uncontroversial, I think, to reconstruct these forms with close vowels. So this is 15 of the 24 cognates in correspondence set B can right off the bat be reconstructed with close vowels. Now, there are some apparent exceptions to this generalization that we can reconstruct the forms with close vowels, represented here by the forms in 7 to 9. There are actually 6 of the 24 forms. There's some other forms as well that have a similar pattern to these ones, where in both Metsam and in Metnyo, the vowel nuclei are non-close, and or in these cases. And if we only had data from Metsam and Metnyo to go on, then it would be entirely reasonable to reconstruct these forms with the non-close vowel nuclei that we see in both Metsam and Metnyo. But if we look outside of Ambel, outside of the Ambel dialect to other Rash languages, then what we find is that all of the cognates in Rash languages have close vowels E or U. Okay, so in the case of good here, all of the cognates have E, so we've got fi, mafia, fi, and so forth. In the case of house, the cognate forms all have vowel U. Similarly with to as well, all of the cognate forms have U. So one scenario that might have occurred is that these forms, I think, again, we can uncontroversially reconstruct these forms to Proto-Rash with a close vowel. And what may have happened is that these forms were inherited into Proto-Ambel with the close vowel intact, and that there was then subsequently a process of vowel breaking in both the Metsam and the Metnyo dialects. And these vowels diphthongized, these close vowels diphthongized in open syllables. Today, synchronically, I analyze these as vowel glide sequences, but phonetically they're diphthongs. So if that scenario is indeed correct, then possibly in Proto-Ambel we can reconstruct these forms with close vowel nuclei as well. Now I'm going to leave correspondence set B there. I'm going to stick a pin in it. We will come back to it in just a tick. Let's take a look at correspondence set C. So correspondence set C is the set in which the Metsam forms are toneless and the Metnyo forms have high tone. And again, we see this patterning of vowel height going on here. So most of the items in correspondence set C can, again, uncontroversially, straightforwardly be reconstructed with non-close vowel nuclei a or o. So there are 15 items in correspondence set C. 9 of them, represented by the first 5 here, 9 of them can be reconstructed with non-close vowel nuclei, again for the same reason. Non-close vowel nuclei in both Metsam and Metnyo, and any other Rash cognates as well. They have non-close vowel nuclei. I just realized I meant to mention earlier here, I'm using orthographic transcription here. So the Y represents palatal glide, that's the Y. Okay, so 9 of the 15 cognates can be reconstructed with non-close vowel nuclei. There are a couple of groups within set C which are less straightforward to reconstruct. The first group here, 2 of the 15 correspondences. In this case, the Metsam form has a non-close vowel e. The Metnyo form has a close vowel e. So do we reconstruct an e? Do we reconstruct an e? There is some synchronic evidence to suggest that the Metsam forms may be more archaic. In the case of 6 and 7, Arechinat and Rain, the Metsam forms are actually available to the very oldest Metnyo speakers as sort of high register or archaic variants. So this suggests to me that, the Metsam forms are indeed more archaic, and we can reconstruct these with non-close vowel nuclei. Similarly with coconut and moon here, non-close vowel nuclei in Metsam, close vowel nuclei in Metnyo. And here we actually see synchronic age grading effect in Metnyo, such that the very oldest speakers of Metnyo have the kaut and the kut forms in free variation. And the kut and tun forms are only used by the youngest it's the youngest generation of Metnyo speakers which use these forms. So again, this suggests to me that the Metsam forms are the more archaic. Okay, so taken all together, this means that 13 of the 15 items in correspondence set C can be, I think, fairly confidently reconstructed with non-close vowel nuclei. And if we go back to correspondence set B, 19 of the 24 items in correspondence set B can be reconstructed with close vowel nuclei. So just to drive the point home here, here we see a very strong patterning of vowel height and whether the Metnyo form is toneless or has a high specification. There are exceptions, but this is pretty strong patterning, I'd say. So I think that the most reasonable explanation for these observed patterns is that in Proto-Ambel, all of these monosyllables were toneless, and that there was then a split in the toneless syllables such that they remained toneless if the vowel was close vowel I or U, and developed high tone and merged with the already existing high tone if the vowel was non-close, if it was a, or o. And these stated conditions, there are exceptions, as I say, but they account for 32 of the 39 cognates in set B and C with a very low p-value. It's very unlikely that this has occurred, these patterns have occurred due to chance. Okay, so that's the Ambel split. Let's now take a look at the Maya split. Okay, so Maya is spoken in various locations throughout the archipelago. Historically, it was a lingua franca of Raja Ampat, not so these days. But yeah, there are various dialects of Maya. So there are 3 dialects spoken on Waigeo Island in the north here. There's a second dialect spoken in 2 locations on Salawati Island. And then there's there's a fourth dialect spoken in 2 locations on Salawati Islands, and then there's a 5th dialect spoken on Misol Islands. Okay, so I don't have a reconstruction of the word prosodic system of Proto-Maya, but Bert Remijsen, who has done the most work on the Maya varieties, he says that the dialect of Maya spoken on Salawati Island, this is the most archaic, the most conservative word prosodic systems, and there have been various changes in the other word prosodic systems of the other dialects. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'll be using data from Salawati Maya as a proxy for Proto-Maya. Okay, so again, a little bit of an overview of the phonology. Again, segmentally, really nothing to write home about. However, Maya is very interesting in terms of its word prosodic system. It has a system of lexical tone like in Ambel. So whereas in Ambel we were using diacritics to transcribe tone, in Maya the convention is with superscript numerals. So there's a 3-way contrast between rise syllables, high syllables, and toneless syllables. The rise toneme of Salawati Maya corresponds to the low toneme of Misol Maya. Tone is restricted to word final syllables, so we only ever get a tonal specification on word final syllables. What's really interesting about Maya is that as well as a system of lexical tone, there is also a system of lexical stress as well. So this is an extremely rare combination cross-linguistically. The primary acoustic correlate of stress is length. So length isn't contrastive, but it is used as a correlate of stress. And stress is limited, stress assignment is limited to penultimate and final syllables. As I should have said earlier, in Maya, like in Ambel, most of the lexicon is monosyllabic or disyllabic, but there are longer words as well. So yeah, stress is restricted to penultimate and final syllables. So we find minimal pairs like the words meaning Greece and light here, where both have a high tonal specification on the final syllable, but whereas the word meaning Greece is finally stressed, the word meaning light is penultimately stressed. Okay, so unlike with Ambel, in Ambel, I compared the two dialects and showed you the tone split with regards to the relationship of the two dialects to each other. With Maya, I'm not going to be comparing the two dialects. I'm going to be comparing the tone system of Maya with the tone system of what we think is probably its sister Matbat, based on, we think it's its sister based on morphological and lexical evidence, but also based on the tonal correspondences that I'm going to be talking about just now. So I'll introduce you to Matbat as well. So Matbat, spoken across Misol Island down in the south of the archipelago here. Once again, no surprises, not much going on with the segmental inventory. We do have a 7-vowel system in Matbat, as opposed to the 5-vowel systems of Ambel and Maya. But in terms of word prosody, Matbat has an incredibly complex tone system, particularly, again, for an Austronesian language. So Remijsen 2007 analyzes Matbat with 6 contrastive tones. And then these 6 tones also contrast with toneless syllables as well. So there are some minimal pairs showing the distinctions here. So again, in Matbat, as in Maya, we use superscript numerals to transcribe the tone. Okay, so as with the Ambel comparisons, I took monosyllabic cognates from Maya and Matbat and compared them to see what patterns there are, what correspondences there are with regards to the different tonal specifications. Now, because of the incredible complexity of the Matbat tone system, obviously things are more complex here also with the correspondences. Also, okay, so I identified 41 cognates, monosyllabic cognates between Matbat and Maya. You'll notice for the vast majority of cognate sets, there's only sort of one or two items in there, and so it's sort of like bitty little correspondences. Nothing that we can really do much work with, unfortunately. So I'm going to be I'm not going to be talking about most of these correspondence sets. What I am going to be talking about is correspondence sets B, C, and D. In these correspondence sets, the Matbat monosyllables are specified with high tone, and the Maya monosyllables are specified either high, rise, or toneless. I actually won't talk about the toneless because we've only got one item in here. Again, there's not much we can do with that. I will be talking about the high and the rise monosyllables here. And again, what I'm going to be arguing is that in an ancestor of Matbat and Maya, these the monosyllables in sets B and C were specified with high tone, and then there was a split in Maya such that the monosyllables with close vowel nuclei remained high, and those with non-close vowel nuclei developed rise tone. Okay, so we'll start out with correspondence set C because that's more straightforward to explain. So there are 12 items in correspondence set C, and not a single one of these items has a close vowel in either Matbat or Maya. So again, when I saw this, I thought, gosh, not another example of a relationship between tone and vowel height in Raja Ampat. I actually couldn't believe it when I first saw it. But yeah, it looks like, again, these forms, I'm not going to do the reconstructions here because comparative work on Matbat and Maya is much more preliminary than it is in Ambel, but I would say that I would be surprised if any of these forms could be reconstructed with close vowel nuclei based on the Matbat and the Maya data, but also on cognates in other Rash languages as well. So 12 of the 12 items in set C have non-close vowels. If we turn to correspondence set B, there are 17 items in this correspondence set. Many of them do have close vowels in both Matbat and Maya. So 10 of the 17, there's this comprehensive list here. 10 of the 17 have close vowels in both Matbat and Maya. And then if we look at other Rash cognates as well, they typically have close vowels as well. So again, looks like there was a close vowel in an ancestor of Matbat and Maya. Some don't, however. 7 of the 17 items are exceptions. In the case of numbers 11, 12, and 13, come, mountain, and sea turtle here, if we look at evidence from other rash cognates, there is some evidence that actually we might be able to reconstruct these higher up the family tree with close vowels. So I'll show you the data for these as well again. So yeah, number 11, come. Whereas in Matbat and Maya, they both have non-close nuclei. In the other rash cognates, every single cognate that we have for rash language, they all have close vowel nuclei. Same with the word meaning mountain, all have close vowel nuclei here. So in the case of these two, I think further up the family tree, as I say, we can probably reconstruct close vowel nuclei. Possibly true of 13 sea turtle as well, but the picture is less clear here. So whereas some rash cognates have close vowel nuclei, others don't. The picture, yeah, somewhat more complicated here by the fact that this form is reconstructed to Proto-Malayo-Polynesian with a non-close vowel as well. So it's not entirely straightforward. It's not entirely clear to me whether this should be reconstructed with a close vowel or a non-close vowel. As for items 14 to 17, these just constitute straightforward exceptions. So there's no evidence from either Matbat or Maya or from the other rash cognates to suggest that these can be reconstructed with close vowel nuclei. Nevertheless, again, if we take a look at the summary of the vowel quality in the various correspondence sets, then we see very strong patternings again with regards to whether a vowel is close or not close, and whether the form in Maya has a high tone specification or a rise tone specification. So yeah, so as I say, I argue here that in an ancestral language, which for the sake of argument we'll call Proto-Maya Matbat, syllable specified with high tone remained high if the vowel was close, and then developed rise tone, either merging with a former rise tone or creating a new phonological tone rise, I don't know, if the vowel was not close. And these stated conditions, again, account for the vast majority of the cognates in sets B, C, and D at a conservative count, i.e. not including the forms meaning mountain, come, and sea turtle. This would account for 22 of the 30 cognate sets. A non-conservative count in which we include the forms for mountain, sea turtle, and come. The number would rise to 25 of the 30 cognate sets, and the p-value would also drop substantially as well, to 0.0004. Okay, so let's take stock. So I said at the top of the talk, tone splits from vowel height are incredibly rare worldwide. So yeah, as I say, we've got a lot to talk about, including how many other attestations are there worldwide, what are the phonetic mechanisms of underlying these tone splits, and if they are so rare in the world, why do we see these tone splits occurring not once but twice in Raja Ampat? So I'm going to touch on all of these issues. Okay, so in the late 1970s, when researchers were just beginning to get to grips with with segmental influences on the development of phonological tone, it was thought that that vowel height doesn't play any role in the development of lexical tone. So to be fair, the quotes that I've got on this slide here, these both refer to tonogenesis, so the development of tone in a previously atonal language, and that's not, to be clear, that is not what we're talking about in Raja Ampat. What we're talking about in Raja Ampat is developments in the tone system subsequent to tonogenesis. So tonogenesis, these languages were already tonal, and we're looking at splits in the tone systems. However, it's sort of generally received idea that vowel quality, that tone cannot originate in vowel quality, and that's sort of thought to be a universal to the extent that anybody ever really thinks about it, and is propagated throughout a lot of research on tonal developments to this day. However, since the 1970s, we are seeing an increasing body of evidence to suggest that while rare, diachronic effects on vowel quality on tone do occur, either in terms of tonogenesis, so the original development of tone in a previously atonal language. So, for example, in the Austroasiatic language U, open syllables, which had at least one voiceless obstruent in the syllable onset, became high-toned if the vowel was reconstructed with an E or an U if the vowel was close. Otherwise, these syllables developed low tone. So this was in the process of tonogenesis, vowel height having an effect on the tone that developed. Or in terms of tone splits in an already tonal language, like we've just seen in Maya and Ambel. For example, in the Afro-Asiatic language bench, there was a formerly predictable allotonic variation in the high tone, in that high tone syllables with close vowel nuclei E or U were predictably realized with extra high tone, with extra high pitch, sorry, whereas syllables elsewhere are realized just with high pitch. But then phonological developments in the vowel system of bench meant that this formerly predictable difference became unpredictable and became distinctive. So we had the emergence of an extra high tone. Okay, so the phonetic mechanisms underlying consonantal influences on tonal developments are well known. For example, the transphonologization of voicing contrasts into a tone system of onset consonants into a tone system based on consonant mergers and so forth. But yes, you may be wondering what the phonetic mechanisms underlying tonal developments from vowel height may be. Well, one very obvious explanation is that we're seeing a phonologization of a phonetic phenomenon known as intrinsic fundamental frequency. So intrinsic fundamental frequency is to do with the production of vowels and microprosodic variations in the fundamental frequency of close vowels versus non-close vowels. Okay, so intrinsic fundamental frequency is a near universal. It's been attested in, I think it's 31 different languages from 11 different language families. And in intrinsic fundamental frequency, close vowels like E and U are realized with a higher fundamental frequency than non-close vowels like A. So the cross-linguistic average difference between E and U and A is 15.6 hertz, 15.3, 15.6 off the top of my head, I've forgotten. Around about, yeah, 15 hertz. And intrinsic fundamental frequency is found in atonal languages, like English here. So I've extrapolated from various studies the differences in fundamental frequency between E, A, and U from English here. Intrinsic fundamental frequency is also tested in tonal languages as well. Okay, so intrinsic fundamental frequency very neatly accounts for the majority, or for all of the other tone splits and tonogeneses that we've seen tested in the literature so far, in that we can see how the close vowels E and U, the fundamental frequency differences are reanalyzed as being not microprosodic differences, but to do with phonological tone. So they separate off and develop high tone. And this is what we see happening in all of the other attestations so far. So, for example, as we looked at in U, it was the high vowels that developed the close vowels that developed high tone. In bench, we saw it was the close vowels that developed extra high tone. So we've got this relationship between the close vowels and higher phonological tones. This also neatly accounts for the proto-Maya, for the Maya split, in that it was the high tone syllables remained high if the vowel was close. So again, we've got this relationship between close vowels and high tone. But some of you may have noticed that this does not account for the split that we saw in Ambel, because in Ambel we observed it was the opposite effect. the toneless syllables are realized with low pitch in Ambel, so they're right down the bottom of the speaker's pitch range. These toneless syllables remained toneless, so there's an association of tonelessness, low pitch, with close vowels in Ambel, whereas it's the non-close vowels that developed high tone. So how can we account for this? Well, as I say, intrinsic fundamental frequency, all else being equal, close vowels are produced with higher fundamental frequency than non-close vowels. There is one very important exception to the intrinsic fundamental frequency effects, and that is in low-pitched contexts, okay? So in low-pitched contexts, intrinsic fundamental frequency differences are reduced or even neutralized. So this is true in atonal languages like English. So if you have utterance, when you find a word in utterance final position and you get a pitch declination at the end of an utterance, at the very end of an utterance, you don't find any intrinsic fundamental frequency differences. This is also true in tonal languages as well, such as Taiwanese Chinese. I've extrapolated some data here. So the blue line at the top here, this represents the syllables which have a high specification in Taiwanese. And the red line at the bottom here, this is the syllables which have a low tone specification. So the high tone specification, these are all obviously clustering up at the top of the fundamental frequency range here because they've got a high specification. But in addition to the high fundamental frequency, due to there being high tone specified, we also see the fundamental frequency effects here. So the close vowels E and U are realized with even higher fundamental frequency than the non-close vowels A. Whereas the low tone syllables down at the bottom here, we find that the close vowels and the non-close vowels are realized with more or less the same fundamental frequency. Okay, so this neatly, this actually this kind of explains what's going on in Ambel a little bit, because in all of the cases of the tone splits that we've seen so far, including the Maya tone split that we looked at earlier, it was high tone syllables that were targeted. So in all of the attestations that we've seen except Ambel, it was the high tone syllables that were targeted. So high tone syllables, we would expect to see these fundamental frequency differences. However, in Ambel, it wasn't the high toned syllables that was targeted, it was the toneless syllables that were targeted, and we would predict there not to be any intrinsic fundamental frequency differences in the toneless syllables because these are realized with the lowest pitch in Ambel. So that explains why we're not seeing the relationship that we would normally expect to see between close vowels and high tone in Ambel. But why then are we seeing a relationship between non-close vowels and high tone? Because if they're being realized with the same fundamental frequency, then we shouldn't expect to see any relationship between closeness of vowel and tone. Allow me to introduce you to a second phenomenon known as intrinsic pitch, this things get a little bit speculative here, but I think that intrinsic pitch might be part of the story of what happened in the Ambel split. So whereas intrinsic fundamental frequency is a phenomenon to do with the production of vowels, so what the speaker is actually producing in terms of fundamental frequency, intrinsic pitch is a perceptual phenomenon. So what are the hearers actually perceiving from the speaker? So it's an auditory mechanism. Intrinsic pitch is an auditory mechanism by which, paradoxically, hearers actually perceive close vowels as lower in pitch than non-close vowels, okay? So, for example, if speakers of English are presented with stimuli, vowels, vocalic stimuli E, A, and U, and these vowels are synthesized such that the fundamental frequency of these three vowels is identical, speakers will reliably identify vowels E and U as being lower in pitch than A. Okay, so even though they've all got identical fundamental frequency, speakers perceive E and U as being lower in pitch than A. So this is thought to be some kind of auditory compensation for intrinsic fundamental frequency, to compensate for these intrinsic fundamental frequency differences. So while speakers are producing the vowels with differences in intrinsic fundamental frequency, the hearers are perceiving the vowels as all being the same pitch. So the blue line here is what the speakers are actually producing, and then the red line is the compensatory intrinsic pitch effects. This is what the speakers are actually hearing. Okay, so how does this apply to Ambel? Well, at this stage, I should mention that my comparative work in Raja Ampat suggests that the Ambel tone system can't be reconstructed higher than Proto-Ambel. In other words, tonogenesis occurred in Proto-Ambel. So the tone system of Ambel is actually not, it developed separately from the tone systems of Maya and Matbat. So before tonogenesis, in atonal pre-Proto-Ambel, intrinsic pitch was used to compensate for intrinsic fundamental frequency differences, which at that point affected all vowels. So here we have what I hypothesized was going on in pre-Proto-Ambel. Intrinsic fundamental frequency differences applied to all vowels, and then hearers were perceiving them all as the same pitch. Once Proto-Ambel acquired tone, intrinsic fundamental frequency differences were then reduced for the vowels with the lowest pitch. So that would be the toneless syllables, syllables with tonal, which didn't have a tonal specification, realized with low pitch, and because they were realized with the lowest pitch, the intrinsic fundamental frequency differences were reduced. So I'll play a little animation while I'm talking, which will hopefully make this clear. So here we see the blue line. This is what the speaker is actually producing. The fundamental frequency differences are being neutralized, but the speakers continue to use the intrinsic pitch to compensate for the former intrinsic fundamental frequency differences. And so this sort of pushes up the perception of the non-close vowels in the hearer's pitch, what the hearer's hearing in terms of pitch. So eventually we predict that, or I predict that if speakers continue to compensate for these former intrinsic fundamental frequency differences after the differences were reduced, then the toneless syllables with the non-close vowels e, a, and a would have been perceived as higher in pitch than those with the close vowels e or u, even though we predict the fundamental frequency of these to have been roughly the same. These non-close vowels were thus reanalyzed as bearing high tone and then merged with the other high tone syllables. Okay, all right, so I hope you're all still with me. So that's the substance of what I wanted to talk to you about today. So just very briefly in conclusion, some takeaway messages for you. So, I mean, the main message here is that contrary to what some have claimed, vowel height can and does have an effect on the development of phonological tone. We've seen 2 more examples of that today to add to the 6 that that have already been attested. Not only that, but in Metnyo Ambel, we see the first ever attestation of high tone on non-close vowels. So yeah, in all former attestations, it was high tone on close vowels. Metnyo Ambel, first example of high tone on non-close vowels. I presented some possible phonetic explanations for the development of high tone on close vowels, intrinsic fundamental frequency, phonologization of microepisodic differences, and a possible, somewhat speculative, but a possible story for how high tone developed on the non-close vowels in Metnyo Ambel. Very briefly, I just want to talk about why, if this is so rare worldwide, why is this occurring so much in Raja Ampat? If we return to our list of previous attestations of tonal developments and vowel height, and we add to our list Maya and Ambel here, the more eagle-eyed among you might notice that of these 8 attestations, 4 of them have occurred in Austronesian languages. So we've got 3 Shuang languages down at the bottom here in which there's been a tone split based on vowel height. And we've got 1 oceanic language up here where vowel height played a role in tonogenesis. So this is definitely noteworthy because, as I said earlier, tone is incredibly rare in Austronesian languages. Of the 1,200 or so Austronesian languages, only 20 have been attested with tone, and of those 20, 4 of them we're seeing developments of phonological tone from vowel height. So what's going on is the question. Bob Blust in an excellent paper looks at various sound changes in Austronesian that are not predictable based on cross-linguistic, what we know about cross-linguistically common phonetic mechanisms. He suggests that oddly conditioned sound changes like this, or clustering of oddly conditioned sound changes like we're seeing in Shuang and Oceanic languages, might be due to some inherited structural pressure from a common ancestor. So in this case, I'm thinking possibly there's something going on with intrinsic fundamental frequency in Austronesian languages. So perhaps the difference between close vowels and non-close vowels, or close vowels and the most open vowels in Austronesian languages is larger than the cross-linguistic average, possibly something like that, which means that these the fundamental frequency is more available to phonologization in Austronesian languages. And so this is what I'm looking at in my postdoc project, or one of the things that I'm looking at in my current postdoc project, where I've been going back to Raja Ampat and managed to squeeze in a little field trip before the pandemic hit. So I do have some data to work with. First of all, analyzing the word prosodic systems of the undocumented Raja Ampat languages. There's some cool stuff going on there. But importantly for this presentation, I want to carry out some phonetic investigations into intrinsic fundamental frequency in Raja Ampat, and that's in collaboration with Zhao Yinggao and James Kirby here at Edinburgh. Okay, so yes, that's all I have to say. Huge thank you to my sponsors of my fieldwork and fieldwork funders, to all the Raja Ampat communities that I've worked with, and also to you, the audience, for listening, and I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thank you for a very clear talk. We've already got a question from David, but I might, sorry, just because I'm, introduced you, I'm going to take the liberty of asking my question first, which is actually a comment as much as a suggestion for a slight refinement of the analysis. And people who are here will know better than I do, but I believe that this kind of thing that you're describing for Ambel, where the high vowels end up with a lower tone, I believe that is not unheard of in the so-called register languages of Southeast Asia, where part of so-called tone is, certain vowels belong to low tone, certain vowels belong to high tone. And I believe that's certainly known to be conditioned by vowel quality. And the explanation I always heard was that it was to do with F1, not F0. Mm. So F1 is low for high vowels and high for low vowels. And the way I understood it was it's that spectral prominence, F0 and F1, very close together. And this is what you're talking about with the Gussenhoven, the perceptual. You hear high vowels as being lower, and it's because of that spectral prominences. This relates to dispersion focalization theory for why, certain vowel systems exist. But what the ear tunes into is that very low spectral energy for high vowels. And then there's a big gap until the next spectral prominence are typically, say, for an E vowel, but not necessarily perhaps for an U vowel, but there's always quite a gap between F1 and F2. So that was what I heard. So I guess I'm saying to you it's a refinement. I think it's probably due to F1 and the spectral prominence issue. And I think it's probably a little bit more common than you might have guessed if you look at the register languages. So, yeah.
Right, yeah, thanks for that. I haven't extended my sort of literature review out to the register languages yet, so that'll be a really helpful place to look, I think. Thanks. Yeah,
people here might have, I'd have to search for a name of an exact language, but people here might know off the top of their heads. David asked, hang on, I'm just going to see the chat a little bit better. Why do you think that tone splits originating from vowel height are so rare? Logically, one would have thought that the intrinsic pitch should sometimes give rise to tones. Why is it so rare?
So various proposals have been put forward for this, because you're right. Like if intrinsic fundamental frequency is a near universal, then you would expect to see this being phonologized more often than we actually do. One suggestion is that the differences in intrinsic fundamental frequency are so context dependent that perhaps hearers aren't getting a constant enough signal to be able to interpret the microprosodic differences as some kind of phonological tone. So as I said earlier in the talk, the differences are neutralized in low pitch contexts. So in atonal languages, if you've got a low utterance, a low intonation final phrase, final intonation curve, something like that, then you don't see the differences there. So perhaps because there's not sort of a reliable signal, this might explain why speakers are not picking up on these differences. Yeah, I also wonder myself if it's perhaps due to intonation contours to a certain extent, because you'll be perceiving the intonation contours most obviously on the vowels and so forth. So perhaps that's muddying the waters somewhat. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Okay, and the next question was from James. What is the nature of the surrounding or possibly pre-existing languages in the area?
In terms of word prosodic systems, that's a great question. Can I share my screen again? Is that okay? Yeah. If I go right back to my map. Yeah, okay, oops. Yeah, that's the one. Okay, so yeah, as I say, Austronesian languages, the Shuang languages, fairly recent incomers to the archipelago. These orange languages here, these are languages belonging to the West Bird's Head family, a completely unrelated language family. These are all atonal, none of these have tone systems. Diachronic was once spoken down in the south of Salawati here. It's now extinct, or probably extinct, and as far as we know, wasn't tonal either. Diachronic only has a single relative in Watan, spoken on the south of the Bird's Head Peninsula down at the bottom here. So yeah, these languages are all atonal. The languages which are geographically most proximate are atonal. However, there are languages spoken towards the center of the Bird's Head Peninsula, several languages which have very basic tone systems, like we see in Ambel, where you might have in some languages there's just a high specification versus a tonal specification. In other languages you have a high and you have sort of a marginal low. So sort of systems which have been characterized in the literature as pitch accent systems, but which are better described as tone systems. Yeah, I mean, it's all very speculative, but we could imagine that a language which was, or languages which was or were either genetically related or typologically similar to these languages spoken in the center of the Bird's Head Peninsula were once spoken in Raja Ampat, and that it was contact with these languages which stimulated tonogenesis in the Austronesian languages, in the Austronesian Raja Ampat languages. This is what I've said in publications on tonogenesis in the Raja Ampat languages. I have suggested that both myself and Dave Kamholtz, who did the subclassification of Shuang, we've both looked for segmental predictors of tone in the Raja Ampat languages, and we haven't been able to find any, neither he nor I found any. And so we both concluded that in lieu of further evidence, tonogenesis was probably stimulated through contact with a tonal non-Austronesian substrate, which is now extinct. However, as a disclaimer, at the time when I did look at the possible segmental predictors of tone, I didn't consider vowel quality, because at the time I was operating under the assumption that vowel quality doesn't have an effect on the development of phonological tone. So I really need to go back to the data and have another look through to see if there is any relationship between vowel quality and if that does predict what tones develop, on what syllables. Not only that, but I would also, before I rule out the possibility of tone having been independently innovated using language internal means in the Raja Ampat languages, I would also like to carry out a reconstruction of at least proto-Rash, because at the moment when we're looking for segmental predictors of tone, we're using both Dave and I are using reconstructions from Proto-Malayo-Polynesian as our guide there. And obviously there are many, many steps between Proto-Malayo-Polynesian and Proto-Rash. A lot's gone on in between there. So I think for us to be able to get a better idea of whether there are any segmental predictors of tone, we do need a reconstruction of Proto-Rash in the first instance. So yeah, as I say, I have said in publications, tonogenesis probably occurred as the result of contact with a tonal non-Austronesian substrate, probably related in some capacity to the tonal languages in the center of the bird's head. Yeah, I would like to do more research on that before I can be absolutely sure.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions here in the chat. I'll just read them out and you can tackle them as you wish. You mentioned that phonetic diphthongs can be analysed as vowel plus approximant. Is that always true? What about colt, coconut, and tone, moon? Can they be analysed as having a vowel plus approximant given the final consonant? And the next question from Stephen, I noticed that the transcription of the words in Maya and Matbat mark tone only on the nucleus vowel and not on final nasals or other sounds. Can you briefly explain why this notation is being used and whether it has any impact on the reconstruction of tones in those languages? They're actually similar questions, aren't they?
No, I don't think so. No? With regards to the phonetic diphthongs in Ambel, okay, so yeah, this is really a phonological argument in that, yeah, so I said generally speaking that words are or syllables are of the structure CV or CVC, but you do get approximants you do get C approximate V syllables, and also you get approximants in the coda of syllables as well. Yeah, it's just more straightforward to analyze. The only diphthongs that occur are those in which there's an U or an E as the second sort of phonetic vocalic segment. And so I think it's just more straightforward to analyze these phonologically as being derived from vowel plus approximate sequences. Does that make sense? With regards to the transcription of words in Maya and Matbat, honestly, I haven't thought about this at all. This is, I'm just using the transcription of Bert Remijsen, who did his work on Maya and Matbat. I'm not clear as to why this notation would have an impact on the reconstruction of tones in these languages. I don't know if you could explain that a little bit.
Well, I suppose if the final is not part of the tone at all, then this may affect the way in which the final element is not regarded as part of the tone, and this may affect the way in which different types of syllables behave. I haven't thought it all through. I just was wondering if you had an opinion on that, that's all.
Right, yeah, okay, I see what you're saying. I don't think that, okay, I'm going to be speaking on behalf of Bert now, which I probably should do, but I don't think that there are any phonetic implications from this transcription. I think that the tone, though the pitch does phonetically extend out to the nose as well in Maya and Matbat. So I'm actually not as familiar with the acoustic data from Maya and Matbat as I am with
I mean, it's an interesting question because normally we think of tones as being aligned with the mora. I mean, sorry, with the, well, or whatever counts as moras in the language. So, I mean, yeah, the question made sense to me. So
yes, yeah, in Ambel it's definitely the tone bearing unit is definitely the mora. Yeah, not only is the mora the unit that bears a lexical tone, but it also bears the first component of intonational contours as well. So you want to get some second components of intonation markers, utterance final intonation markers, or if there are two moras. But Maya and Matbat, I don't actually know off the top of my head if there's been if that's been looked into at all, what the tone bearing unit is.
Brilliant. Okay. If there's no more, is there any more questions? No? Oh, that was great. That was really interesting. You know, yeah. So thank you so much for giving this talk, Laura. And yeah, clap, clap, clap. Okay. So yeah, no, that's brilliant. Okay.